Hi, Jim at Art Painting 101, and today's subject is landscape shadows. I'm no expert. I began painting 4 years ago, but I found that there's this gap in between beginners and intermediate as far as what I found for information on the internet. So I'm going to try to bridge that gap with some of these videos that I'm making. One of the questions was, what color are shadows? Well, shadows are not any particular color. In other words, shadow does not impart color. It's best to think of shadow as direct light and indirect light. And the indirect light creates the shadow. So the shadow normally is the color of whatever it happens to fall on. But the value is different and the color temperature is different. And the color temperature is very important in creating what we visually see as shadows in paintings. What is color temperature? Well, let me show you. So this is the color wheel, and as you can see here, cool colors go from red, violet up to green, which is getting warmer, and go from red up to back to yellow, green, and these are the warm colors and these are the cool colors. However, color temperature is relative, and what I mean by that is we start with this green and we move to blue green, we're getting cooler. If we move to yellow green, we're getting warmer. We start here at blue violet is cooler, but blue green is warmer. And that's an important concept with shadows. When we're talking about a warmer color showing more light, more direct light, and a cooler color showing a deeper shadow, this is the idea behind what we want to do. So you're going to find that most shadows in landscapes, outdoors, in daylight, are going to tend to be blue, violet, violet in their consistency. And that's partially because the reflected light mostly comes from the overhead sky, which is bright blue. If we want to learn more about shadows, what we should do is during the day actually look at shadows that are cast everywhere. And I think you'll find that most shadows you can easily see into, as opposed to when you're working from a photographic reference, the shadows usually appear as black, and they rarely do if we're outside in the real world. Our vision is much better than the cameras, and we can see into shadows. We see shapes, colors, whereas the cameras tend to register them all as black. So if you're working from photographs, remember that. Either lighten the exposure so that you can see into the shadows, or just adjust it on your own. So as I said before, one of the tricks to getting good shadows is to show contrast between lit areas and shadow areas. And one of the tricks that painters use is color temperature as well as value. Now, value is how light or dark a certain tone or color appears. But color temperature is much more involved. Things that are in direct light in the landscape are usually very warm colors, and the shadows tend to be much cooler colors. This helps the viewer read the painting as light and shadow, and that's really what you're trying to do. In this painting of the yellow house, we have strong shadows, and here across the lawn you can see this shadow is darker in value but also much cooler in temperature than the sunlit area of the grass. The same is true for the side of the building. This area is much cooler than this area, which is warm, signifying light. You can also see it on the edges of the trees, showing that there's a warm light here and a cooler light here. And again, on the chimney here, you can see the same thing. Now, this is achieved both with value and color temperature. In my painting, Nash Point Lighthouse, we have a bunch of different shadows and values. In this photograph, I've used Photoshop to drag the colors up into the lightest area so you can see exactly what the values and color temperatures are. You can see that the white, which has a small amount of pink or orange in it to create sunlight effect, really contrasts well against the blue shadows. And you can see here that in the area where there's more reflected light, the value is less and the color isn't quite as strong. And in the back of this area here where there's less reflected light, you can see that the color is much darker. And it gets even darker here where the grass, which doesn't reflect light well, creates even darker shadow behind the wall. Another thing to notice is that the shadow along the lighthouse pillar is diffused. It slightly increases and gently decreases as it comes around into the sunlit areas. The idea of color, temperature, and value here are creating very strong shadows. So I created a painting just specifically for this video. I'm going to call it Fun with Shadows. And one of the things that I'm going to show here is that I first took this subject here and simplified it. Now, I don't typically do all this in Photoshop. Normally, I would just do this mentally. But I cropped the picture much closer. You can see it has a much more reduced area, and that makes it much more simple. I widened the walkway. I took out the people. I took out some of the details here. I removed the bench, so as to bring this down to much more simple form. So here are two versions of the finished painting. This was the original version, and as you can see, the brown here, or the warm color temperature, really draws your eye to this area as opposed to the cool temperatures in this one. The values are quite nearly the same, but the cool temperature really helps set back the shadow area. Now, this color shadow is not actually correct in the sense that it is not what we saw in the photograph, but we can have fun with shadows. It's clear that it is a shadow, and we don't always need to be representationally correct as to the color. This also implies shadow, and we have a shadow here and a shadow color here, and again, this area of the building is in shadow. It's much bluer than the white area here that has full sun. And the same thing along here with a slightly grayer green and a darker green in the background that creates the effect of a shadow. Once again, we have dark greens here, and once again, the strong structure of warm color, warm, cool, warm, and cool creates the idea of a shadow in the painting. In this painting of the forest, we have again the color temperature difference, also values, but the warm gray of the road and the cool gray of the shade, even though there is a difference in value, the values here are fairly close, but the color temperature is quite dramatically different. And again, we have the warm color of the sun on the side of the trees and the cooler side here in the shade. It even gets even cooler as we go back into the distance here. Also, just you should notice is that the background has got a kind of a blue-gray, and the trees back here are bluer to help push back the area in depth, which leads to a much better painting. Here in the painting Wiltshire Walk, you can see again that it's the warm colors here that create a sunlight area, and we have darker shadows in value here underneath the tree. We also have some lighter shadows that are cast across the road. This area being much brighter, it diffuses the shadows so that they are not quite as strong. And also please notice that the painting begins to gray out as it goes into the background, which gives it more depth. One of the things is I was working from a reference photo. This area was entirely black. Once again, cameras render shade frequently as just black. But however, if you were standing there, you would never see that area as black with your eyes. So remember that you can use dark values to create shadows that appear black in photographs and get much better results on a whole. You'll have better contrast across the color scale if you do that. Now, if you're a beginner and you're trying to work with shadows, one of the things I can suggest is that you use simple forms and shapes and don't do anything that's really complicated until you get the hang of it. I worked for 6 months with just painting light and shadow in almost all my subjects. And to be honest with you, it really greatly helped my understanding and work with shadows. And shadows can be very dramatic and make essentially great paintings out of something that might not be so interesting. In this painting of 3 maple trees, you can see we have a relatively simple subject, and the shadows here really make the subject interesting. Once again, we have a warmer green and a cooler green. This green in and of itself is actually rather cool. It's kind of a gray green, and it's not especially warm, but it is warm in comparison to this one. And the same goes for the trees here. You have a fairly cool green, but an even cooler green here, giving you the color temperature difference that creates the idea of shadows. I hope this video was helpful in your understanding of shadows and how to use them and how to paint them. Next time, we'll be talking about flesh tones because I keep getting questions about that. Please like, share, and subscribe